So a few hours ago, a big truck dropped off the new Forte 4s. And you know what that means? It's time for me to haul these heavy speakers up the stairs, do some listening, and then tell you all what they're like and if they're worth getting excited about. So come on, let's get started. All right, so here we have one chunky American boy. And even though it looks exactly like the outgoing Forte 3, I don't really mind. And that's because the Forte is essentially an old school type loudspeaker. One that says, hey, if you want big clean sound, then you need to use big drivers inside of a large enclosure. So we're going to kick this off by first summarizing the overall design of the Forte 4, which in a nutshell is a three-way tower speaker with a passive radiator on the back. In the front we have three drivers, so up top we have a 1-inch titanium dome tweeter housed inside this little baby horn. Beneath that we have a 1 3/4-inch polyimide driver housed inside this much larger horn, and then on the bottom we have a 12-inch paper cone woofer. Now let's take a look at the back. And this is where you're going to notice the awesome 15-inch passive radiator. And of course, we have our speaker terminals on the bottom. Now, the overall design goal of the Forte is to offer a lot of clean sound output from a relatively small footprint. Now, I say relatively because, let's face it, this is not a small speaker. In fact, they weigh just over 70 pounds apiece. And trust me, they're not a whole lot of fun to haul up the stairs. So now it's time to talk about the differences between the Forte 4 and the outgoing Forte 3. But before we even go there, we need to acknowledge the similarities because there are quite a few. So the Forte 4 borrows a lot of the parts from the Forte 3, namely the enclosure, the woofers, the tweeter, the grills, the binding post, and even the veneer. Now, according to Klipsch, though, there are going to be some key differences. Apparently, the crossover was reworked. And then when we take a closer look at the tweeter, we'll notice that the phase plug has been modified. Essentially, it's designed to better distribute sound out into the room, and plus, it's designed to make it to where when you listen to these speakers, you won't notice where the high frequencies are coming from quite as much as you did with the previous generation. But in my opinion, one of the biggest changes is the compression driver that they now use, which I mentioned earlier, the 1 3/4-inch polyimide compression driver. So the big question is, though, is there a big difference between the 4 and the 3 in terms of performance? Because there has been a price hike. They're no longer $4,000 and are instead $4,500. So, are they worth it? Should you upgrade? Are they good in general? Well, those are all questions that we're going to talk about now. Okay, since I have so much ground to cover in this review, I'm going to try and keep things easy for you all by first giving you a general overview as to what the Forte 4s sound like. And then afterwards, well, that's when I'll transition into more details, such as how I feel they stack up to the outgoing Forte 3s, whether or not I think they're worth it, as well as the usual information that I cover in these ridiculously long reviews. But first, let's talk about the sound. So, honestly guys, the Forte 4 is one of those speakers to where it only takes a few seconds of listening to truly understand what they're all about. Which, in the case of the Forte 4, look, they're like every other Klipsch Heritage product. They're meant to recreate the sensation of a live musical event. Meaning that they're for the kind of listener who says, hey look, if I'm spending that kind of money on a set of speakers, I want it to sound like I'm right there in a concert hall. Or you want it to sound like there are musicians playing right there in your living space, and that they're so close to you that you can practically just reach out and touch them. If that's the kind of listening experience that you're going for, then yeah, there's a good chance you're going to like the Forte 4. However, if you're looking for more of a laid-back and smooth listening experience, then you know what? Odds are you're not going to like these speakers. Nor are you going to like them if you're looking for a conventionally accurate presentation. Because what you're getting here is something that has coloration, the mid-range and the treble, it's lively, it's forward, it projects in a forward way. And the sound is overall about communicating a big sense of scale with strong and dynamic output. So, that's what you're looking for? Check them out. And now let's transition into more details, starting with how I feel they stack up to the Forte 3s. So, in many respects, there's similarities between the two, right? The Forte didn't undergo the same evolution that the Heresy and Cornwall went with their upgrades. So you're going to experience a similar sound, but there are going to be some differences. Some of the subtle differences is that the imaging on the Forte 4 is going to be a little wider. you're going to get a slightly bigger sense of scale within the mid-range. Nothing dramatic, but noticeable. But the big thing that I think most people will notice is that the Forte 4 is a cleaner sounding speaker. From top to bottom, it's going to be more transparent and more revealing. And in some ways, this is a good thing, and in some ways, this is a bad thing. So the good news is that when you listen to average to good recordings, the Forte 4 is going to sound more authentic, more detailed, and just overall, it's going to give you much more that you are there listening experience than the outgoing Forte 3. However, it is also significantly less forgiving of poorly recorded material. So if you listen to a lot of music and you know it's recorded like crud, the Forte 4 is going to rip it to shreds and is not going to try and make it sound easy on the ears. So you have to decide what's more important to you, because the Forte 3 is more forgiving in nature. So do you want that resolution and that more realistic presentation at the expense of not being exactly friendly towards poor recordings? Or do you want something that's not quite as realistic sounding, but at the same time is more forgiving of a wider variety of recorded material? Only you can make that decision. Now, do I think the Forte 4s are worth it over the 3s? Well, obviously it depends on your personal taste, but the advice I would give to people who have Forte 3s and you're considering the Forte 4s is to just hold on to what you have, especially if you love it, and don't sell those speakers to buy the new 4s blindly. Make sure that you listen to them first. And if you're on the fence about whether or not to buy Forte 3s used and or to buy the Forte 4s new, well, just take what I said about the description, weigh it against your own experiences, and decide which type of presentation means more to you. So that is the general Cliff Note version of what the Forte 4 is all about. But you're interested in more detail, then stick around and let's talk about it. Okay, so at this point, we've already established what the Forte 4s sound like in general, which, as with most Klipsch Heritage speakers, is all about giving you that lively, strong, and dynamic sound. Something you're going to experience regardless of how you have them set up. But the key thing here that you need to know is the nuances that you take away from its presentation will depend almost entirely on setup. And by that I mean, in some situations, the Forte 4 can sound outright bright and super aggressive. And then in other circumstances, it can sound relatively easy on the ears and very well balanced between the treble, the mid-range, and the bass. And how you get to those two destinations just depends on setup. So let me tackle it like this. I know a lot of people are going to ask me whether or not I think the Forte 4s are more similar to the Heresies or if I think they're more similar to the Cornwalls. And the answer is, well, both. You see, if you want more of the Heresy sound, which is that rock and roll presentation, right? It does have a lot of treble energy. It's right there in your face pretty much at all times. Well, you can get that from the Forte 4. And all you have to do to achieve that is to literally take the grills off the speaker and point them directly to your listening position. That's it. As soon as you do that, you're going to get that vintage Klipsch sound. However, if you don't really like that type of sound, and maybe you like that idea of a lively, big, dynamic presentation, but you don't want it to in your face, that's cool. All you have to do is point the speakers more directly out into the room with little to no toe in. Doesn't matter if you leave the grills on or off, experiment to taste. And then that's where you get that more balanced presentation. That's when they sound more like a baby Cornwall. And it's up to you to determine which presentation you prefer. And best of all, it's free to try. Now, another thing that I need to emphasize here is that a lot of people are going to worry about the type of equipment they should pair up to speakers like the Forte 4s. And it's always a good question because synergy between your amplifier and your speakers is usually a big deal. But in the case of the Heritage series, I don't think it really matters all too much. They sound consistent almost regardless of what you use, whether it's a Yamaha, a Marantz, a Luxman, whatever, right? Don't worry too much about whether or not your gear is going to sound good with it, because odds are it will. The only thing that you need to make sure of is that you have enough power to satisfy your listening demands. Because while these speakers are easy to drive, yeah, sure, having a lot of power if you listen at loud volumes is still nice. So for a lot of people, if you're in a small room, I'd say 12 watts of tube power should be fine. But for most individuals, anywhere between 30 to 100 watts is where you will want to be, with most probably being between 60 to 100. because these speakers, they do give you clean output, which means you may find yourself cranking the volume a little bit more than you ordinarily would with speakers that tend to distort earlier. So with that out of the way, let's move on to some of the detailed aspects of this presentation, starting with the treble. And I'm going to keep this very short and sweet because the treble, like I said, it just depends on how you have them set up. It could be very bright and in your face if you want it to be, or it could be relatively easy on the ears while still giving you the benefits of a metal dome tweeter. You know, fine detail information, airiness, spaciousness, it has all of that. But again, how forgiving or how aggressive it's going to be depends on setup. Now, when it comes to mid-range, the sense of scale within the mid-range is very good, regardless of how you have these speakers set up. However, whether it's going to sound a little bit bright and beamy, or whether it's going to sound a little more natural and less like a conventional horn sound, well, again, that depends on setup. But I noticed that in the mid-range, I actually think that's the star of the show in the case of the Forte IV, because there's so much information there and it's delivered with expediency. It doesn't sound like, you know, one of those mid-range cone drivers that use thick materials that's just a little bit slow sounding. I mean, this is very instantaneous, and that's what helps to give you that live sensation that you are there listening experience, is that mid-range horn. And then next we have the bass. So the bass is also going to depend on setup. I found that in my room, if I had the speaker set up a certain way, just a little too far out into the room, the Forte IV sounds like it's all mid-range and treble with not a whole lot of bass. However, when I pushed it back literally just a few millimeters, that's when the bass suddenly re-emerged and it sounded very full and very well integrated with the rest of the presentation. Now, the bass is more about speed and power than it is about giving you this visceral rumble, right? It's not going to really rattle the chairs or just rearrange your insides, I should say. That's not the kind of bass it delivers. So whether or not you feel like it will need a subwoofer just depends on your own room and your personal tastes. For me personally, I think with most music you don't really need a sub, but there's going to be occasions to where some people are going to feel differently. Just something for you to be aware of. Dynamic output, of course, is going to be exceptional on this speaker. I mean, really, Klipsch tends to produce class leaders in terms of dynamic output, especially within the Heritage series, and this speaker's of no exception. Incredible dynamic output. Imaging is actually going to be pretty good. So, as I mentioned earlier, this is one of the upgrades that I've noticed with the Forte IV over the Forte III, is that they give you a more defined center image, while at the same time giving you a slightly wider sound stage. Now, no, it's not going to sound like a slim speaker that, quote, disappears into the room. I mean, they're bighorn speakers. They're going to know where they are. But for what they are, yeah, I would say the imaging is going to be pretty good. Power output is fantastic, but the benefit with horns is not only did they sound good at louder volumes, but they also sound great at lower volumes, which is great news for me because that's how I tend to listen to music. So that is going to be it for my detailed dissertation here. So you know what? I think I've covered all the bases already, so let's just go ahead and wrap this up with my own personal thoughts and reactions to the Forte IV. So I'm going to wrap up this video by telling you all what I really think about the Forte IVs. Not as an impartial reviewer, but as an enthusiast, just like all of you. Because the truth of the matter is, my own reaction to the Forte IVs have been mixed. Meaning there are some things about this speaker that I really enjoy, and then there are some things about this speaker that I really don't care for. So to help make sense of this all, first, let's start off with the positives. Now, obviously, I like the overall sound of the Forte IV. This big, strong, dynamic presentation with some liveliness, or a lot of liveliness going on. It's the kind of thing that really does do a great job of making it sound like there's a performance taking place just right there in your room. And that's cool. And that's the reason why there are so many people out there who love the sound of Klipsch Heritage products, and I'm definitely of no exception. Moving on, I like how easy they are to pair with different components, meaning that, as I mentioned earlier, these aren't the kind of speakers to where you really have to fret over whether or not your electronics are going to sound good with the Fortes. Odds are they will. I also like the flexibility in terms of being able to easily manipulate their performance just based off positioning. Now, this may be a turnoff to some individuals, but to me, I absolutely like it. If you want that forward rock and roll sound, you just take the grills off and point the speakers towards you, and there you go. If you want that liveliness, but you don't want it to be too in your face, and if you want more of a balanced sound, you just point the speaker directly out into the room or give it just a little bit of tone, and then there you go. I like having those options, especially if I don't have to pay anything extra to get that flexibility. And then lastly, I enjoy how these speakers handle a wide variety of music. It doesn't really matter what genre that you listen to. Odds are it's going to sound consistent through these speakers. In fact, when I started the reviewing process, I remember listening to some indie first. I believe it was Angus and Julia Stone. Then I moved on to Little Dragon. Then I switched to classic rock like Led Zeppelin, Pink Floyd, Neil Young, Leonard Skinner. Then I moved on to Linkin Park and all these other different groups. And it sounded great with everything. For the most part. Jazz, classical, you name it. Now, that leads me to what I don't really care for about these speakers. Number one, well, when you listen to them, you're going to be aware of the fact that you're listening to horns. So to be clear, this isn't going to be one of those horn speakers that doesn't sound like a horn. You'll notice. But then the big thing is number two, these speakers, while they're not particular about the genres of music that you enjoy through them, they are going to be very particular about the recording quality. Basically it goes like this. If the recordings that you listen to are average to good, then odds are you're really going to enjoy the speakers so long as you like their sound. However, if the recordings that you listen to are below average, then these are going to rip them to shreds. It's not going to put a band-aid over it at all, and it's going to show you exactly how poor the recordings sound, meaning that the speakers are going to sound horrible, at least in those moments. And what this means is that the Forte IV is the kind of speaker that can possibly dictate what you listen to just because it's going to be that ruthless. And this is really the consequence of its design. You have a forward-sounding speaker that's even more energetic than the outgoing Forte III. It's more revealing in nature on top of that. And then, to just really hammer it home, it uses relatively small horns. And when you add all of that together, well, that's what you run into. Now, the next thing that I need to talk about is the positioning of the Forte within the Klipsch lineup. Now, on one hand, I have no problems with how it's positioned, right? I mean, it makes sense. The Forte IV is right in between the much smaller Heresy and the much bigger Cornwall. Totally makes sense. Where I think people are going to get maybe just a little bit lost, though, is the price. Because when you look at the price of the Forte IV, you'll notice it's $4,500. But then when you look at the much larger Cornwall IV, it's $6,000. And let me tell you, if you have enough money to spend on a set of Forte IVs, at least brand new, you could probably afford to stretch out and buy a set of Cornwalls if you really wanted to. And that means some people are going to question not only the value of the Forte IV, but they're going to wonder, well, should I save my money or should I spend the extra money and go with the Cornwall IV? And all I can do is just give you my own impressions of this whole situation. But to me, the answer is, if you can afford the Cornwall, and if you can physically accommodate it in your space, yes, go with the Cornwall. It is still the better speaker in pretty much every way. Even though it uses the same mid-range driver, it sounds more natural because it uses a bigger horn, so it doesn't have that same kind of forced sound that the Forte does. This is just a nature of how horns work. And overall, you're just still getting the better speaker. But the challenge is, you need to have enough space in your room to accommodate the giant Cornwalls. And I think for a lot of living spaces, it just makes more sense to go with something like a Forte IV, which again, you can set it up to sound more like a baby Cornwall, if that's the kind of sound that you're going for. So that is going to be my take on this speaker. Obviously, there's a lot of things to love, but there are some things that you need to be aware of. And hopefully this video has highlighted enough for you to determine if you think this is something that would interest you or not. Anyways, guys, as always, I appreciate you watching. And until next time, enjoy the music and peace.